Hey guys, I'm back with round 7 from the World Open. In this round, I was paired against Gavin Melaugh, who was around 2150. I think he's a young kid, around 15, 16 years old. And I was playing black in this game, and this game actually ended up being probably one of my best games of my recent series of events. I was pretty happy with this one. So he started with c4. I played g6. I think this is the most accurate move order for King's Indian or Grunfeld players to meet the English, so that we're not yet committing our knight to f6 if we don't necessarily need to. But he quickly transposes to simply d4, and we end up getting a pretty typical King's Indian. So e4, d6. I wasn't sure what line he would play. I don't think there was a whole lot of time to prepare, as usual. But yeah, I definitely wasn't unhappy about going into mainline King's Indian. So he ends up going bishop e2 here. I castled, and bishop e3. So this is a pretty interesting line. Normally this move bishop e2 is connected with the Averbakh system with bishop g5. I'm not sure exactly what the bishop e3 line is called. I saw it somewhere being referred to as the Semi-Averbakh line, which kind of makes sense because the bishop only makes it to e3. And it's a pretty rare line, but I've always felt it was somewhat dangerous because white's idea with this one is actually to quickly, in most cases, play g4 and then g5, and just launch this immediate kingside attack, h4, h5, and so on. And if black doesn't know exactly how to get a good counterplay in the center or the queen side, it's very easy to just get blown over here, and white can get a really, really serious attack very quickly. But fortunately, I had a pretty nice idea prepared for this line that I got to use in this game. I actually originally found this maybe a few years ago, but so I was spending a little bit of time during the game trying to recall my analysis. But yeah, I started with this move, knight a6. White played g4. I played c5. And in general, I think from a strategic point of view, it makes sense to go for more of an open position with a c5 break, like in the Benoni, rather than playing e5, which I think after d5 typically gives white kind of what they want. They want to close the center so that they can just attack on the king side. So I've always felt it makes sense to try to keep this diagonal open. So I played c5, d5, and now e6 I think is a very normal move here, and very logical, where black is just trying to take on d5 and open some lines. But my idea was to play this move queen b6, which doesn't seem to be like such an obvious move, because I mean usually this one move attack against the b2 pawn can be easily defended, but there's a lot of concrete details in the position that actually make things a little bit awkward here for white. So number one, the g4 pawn is under a lot of pressure, so that means that white cannot really play queen d2 or queen c1. Black just takes on g4 and wins a pawn. b3 is also inadvisable. It just feels very weakening. Black can take on g4, and the knight on c3 is going to be hanging. And the move rook b1, which I would say maybe looks like the most natural move in the position, is also bad, because here after knight takes g4, it turns out that black has a nice trick, sacrificing a piece but winning back the knight on c3 at the end, and the rook on b1 is hanging. So black is just winning a pawn here and is doing really well. So yeah, already this move queen b6 kind of poses some unpleasant problems for white. There is also move knight a4, which hits the queen and defends the pawn. But here after something like queen a5 check, let's say bishop d2, and I think my prep was to go all the way back to queen d8, and let's say white retreats as well, knight to c3 to defend the e4 pawn. Here we've reached the same position, except we've forced white to put the bishop on d2 rather than e3, which doesn't seem like such a huge achievement, but it does feel like a little something, because now white's queen can't use the d2 square. It's harder for white to castle queenside, and it might just be winning black a full tempo if white ends up playing bishop e3 in the future anyway. So here I think black should just play something like e6, and I think black has a better version of the position before when white's bishop was on e3. So it's a small achievement, but still an achievement. So after some thought, my opponent ends up going for the most critical move here, which I think from white's point of view definitely feels like has to be the right move, and that's the push g5. So he's trying to kick my knight away from f6 first, so that the g4 pawn isn't hanging, and then white can safely play rook b1 or queen d2, and black's queen on b6 doesn't really, is not going to be making a lot of sense in this position. Queen takes b2 is not working for black because of knight a4. Hitting the queen, knight is still under attack, and if I go queen b4 check, white has bishop d2 and everything is protected, and white is winning material next move. But instead I have the big idea. It's kind of what this whole line that I prepped is based on, and that's what the sacrifice knight takes e4. So the point here is that black first grabs one pawn on e4, white plays knight takes e4, then we grab a second pawn on b2, and now since white's rook on a1 is hanging and white has to move the rook either b1 or c1, pretty soon black is going to be able to pick up a third pawn on a2. So these piece for 3 pawn sacrifices are always very, very difficult to evaluate, and this one I think is non-intuitive at all. Mainly because it doesn't feel like black's extra pawns here are going to be particularly strong. But as I found out, when exploring this position with Stockfish, this certainly wasn't my own idea. Obviously, all ideas nowadays just come from the engine. But as I was kind of digging into this position deeper and deeper, I was slowly realizing that the position is actually extremely difficult for white to play. The evaluation is pretty optimistic. It basically gives either equal or black having an advantage in basically all lines. So that's always good to see. But the main thing that attracted me to this position was actually that I felt like the position was very difficult for white to handle. What black wants to do is actually pretty straightforward. The idea is to just put the knight on b4 and start running the a-pawn down the board and trying to queen it. And with this bishop on g7 now completely open, it's actually very difficult for white in the long run to deal with the a-pawn here. In the meantime, usually the side with the extra piece is trying to keep the position somewhat more open so that the pieces have more targets. But it's very difficult for white to actually target anything in black's position. The only pawn that's potentially hanging is the e7 pawn here, but it's very difficult for white to attack this one. And with no targets for the pieces and a relatively blocked structure all over the place, it's hard for white's pieces to really do a whole lot here. Okay, so after some thought, I think my opponent played the best move, rook c1. Rook b1 is also possible, but after queen takes a2, the problem is that black is going to play knight b4 soon, and then after bishop f5, the rook on b1 is going to be a big target. So I think the rook is just better on c1. And here I couldn't exactly recall my prep. I knew that I had looked at the position further, but like I mentioned originally, I found this idea like 3 years ago, and that's when I did all of the initial analysis and preparation. And I wasn't expecting to get this line in this game. I wasn't sure if I would ever get it over the board. So I was remembering some of the key ideas. Of course, I knew that the knight is supposed to go to b4 and I should take this a2 pawn, but I didn't really know in what order I should do anything. And so here I was basically thinking kind of on my own and just trying to figure out how to play the position in the most effective way. Eventually I decided to just grab the pawn on a2. I figured this move should be at least reasonably okay for black. As it turns out, knight b4 is how my prep went back then, and yeah, I still think this is probably the best move in the position. The point is just to activate the knight very quickly and threaten in some lines to even play knight a2 and start harassing white's rook, especially once the bishop gets to f5. I wasn't sure what exactly I should do if white plays like a4 and just tries to give up only 2 pawns rather than the third pawn, but it turns out like bishop f5 and then knight a2 is coming next, and this is just very, very dangerous for white already, and black's pieces are just extremely active. And yeah, if I'm able to win an exchange in the position, then the material imbalance will be that I have a rook versus 2 minor pieces, but with some extra pawns, I think the advantage will definitely be on black's side here. Okay, so I decided to take on a2. White played knight c3, which I think is a reasonable move, trying to take some more control over the queen side. I decided to put the queen on b2, attacking the knight on c3, and now queen d2 was played, which feels like a very natural move. Objectively, bishop d2 I think was a better try, but that's mainly because, as I found out when I was analyzing previously, a lot of these endgames are actually extremely difficult for white. So after queen d2 was played, I didn't really hesitate a whole lot. In fact, I was more than happy to go for this endgame, which means that bishop d2 was probably the right way to go here. Still, after like something like bishop f5, knight f3, knight b4, I think black is doing really well. We have ideas of knight c2 or even knight d3, and yeah, we already have 3 pawns for the piece, so material-wise, black is doing totally okay, and black's pieces are really putting a lot of pressure against white's position here. And pretty soon I'm going to be ready just to start marching the a-pawn forward. So, okay, I think black is a little bit better there, but the position would still be very complicated. I don't think it's an easy position for black to play and just win, without issues. But after queen d2, I did feel like the endgame was extremely comfortable. So I traded on d2, king takes d2, knight b4. And yeah, again, it doesn't look like black's compensation, is really that impressive for a piece. But the problem is that black has a very straightforward plan, and that's to run the a-pawn down the board. And because of the power of the dark square bishop controlling the a1 square in particular, hitting c3 and b2, the power of the light square bishop, which can sit on d7 or f5, and the knight on b4 being such a strong piece. Because of all these factors, it actually just ends up very difficult for white to hold off black's play here. So my opponent here ends up making a mistake, I think, almost immediately with this move, bishop f3. The idea was to bring the knight to e2, but we'll get into why that wasn't exactly working for white. Instead, I think the engine suggests something like h4. Not so much with the idea of playing h5, but rather just trying to develop the knight via the h3 square. Yeah, I definitely feel like black has a clear advantage here. We can play like a5, for example, maybe knight a4, bishop f5, and the thing is that black actually has a couple of ideas. So number one, we have an idea of just trying to even break with b5, with idea c takes b5, knight takes d5, and then black is just winning a lot of pawns in the position and might have a lot of connected passers soon. But the second idea is also just to break with e6 and just start chipping away at white's structure this way. The d5 pawn is going to be under a lot of pressure. If white takes, we can take with the pawn or take with the bishop, but one way or another, black will play d5, and then once the c4 pawn is traded off, then black is going to have 3 connected passers on the queen side, which are just going to be extremely strong. Of course, all of this depends on concrete details. Black can't play d5 while the c5 pawn is hanging, but there are plans of playing simply like rook a6, b6, and making sure the queenside structure is fully secure, and then one day breaking with e6. And in the meantime, it's actually just very difficult again for white to create any counterplay. So black does have a surprising amount of time in this endgame to just very slowly build up, and once the pawns start rolling, it's very difficult for white's pieces to fight against them. Okay, objectively, that was still the best way to go for white, but I do like black's chances there. The problem with bishop f3 is that after bishop f5, I'm now hitting the d3 square, so if white continues with the plan knight ge2, then black would have this move knight d3, and after the rook moves, knight e5 is simply winning material, hitting the bishop, hitting this pawn with check, and if we take this pawn, then again, black's pawns are just going to be rolling extremely quickly here. So my opponent realized in time that this was not possible, and he still can't develop the knight, so he ends up going bishop to g2. This opens up the knight to use the f3 square or h3 square, but again, neither of these squares I think are really useful. He can also play knight g2 now because knight d3, knight e5 is not as strong, but the biggest problem is that white has spent 2 tempi here, and his bishop is certainly not better on g2 than it was on e2. In fact, on g2 it's really just a very passive piece. It's only going to be good if black plays e6. But with the bishop on g2, I'm probably going to wait a long time before I feel like this break is really necessary. So for the time being, the bishop is going to be extremely passive here. So I decided there was no reason not to play a5 here. I was mainly expecting something like knight a4. just to try to keep this pawn blocked for as long as possible. But I don't think the blockade will really hold for very long. One idea is for black just to play rook a6 first and then bishop d7, and white isn't able to defend the knight with rook a1. Another idea is just to play the move knight a2, where white's rook is kind of short on squares, maybe rook e1 or something, rook fb8. And here I think black is even ready to play something like b5 takes, rook takes b5. It's not so pretty for the pawn structure, but it does open up the rooks on the b file, and white's king is actually going to be in a lot of danger here. I mean, the queens are off the board, but black still has 5 pieces in the game, and these pawns are rolling, so white's king is certainly going to be under heavy pressure there. Instead, white played the move bishop h3, which I think is definitely understandable. He's trying to trade some pieces off, especially my strong light square bishop, so maybe he has better chances of setting up some kind of blockade. But he's simply not in time. Already, actually, black could have taken on h3 and just pushed a4, and this would be very similar to the game. I decided to start with the move bishop d3. I felt like this move essentially forces his response with bishop f1. He also has moves like knight b5 or knight a4, but knight b5, for example, I think might simply allow black to just keep pushing the pawn forward, or bishop b2 first actually might be even better than taking on c4. And if knight a4, then I was strongly considering just taking here and then playing b5 and then winning back the pawn, and then black's pawns on the queen side are again mobile and seemingly very, very strong. I don't think black is forced to go into this. I think b5 is also possible as well, just starting to open things up and then going after the d5 pawn. And this move bishop e4 is also, I think, can be very unpleasant in this type of situation, where just hitting the rook, maybe forcing white to play f3, and then taking away this square from the knight for future use. Yeah, I don't remember exactly what my plan was after knight a4. I felt like I had a ton of good options here, and I was just going to figure it out if we got here. Maybe even rook a6 is possible again, just to kind of improve the rook before proceeding. In any case, I was mainly expecting bishop f1, which was played. Then I decided to trade on f1, rook takes f1, and I pushed a4. And here I basically envisioned the next couple of moves, realizing that white has no good way of stopping my pawn from getting to a2. And once my pawn gets to a2, I'm very likely going to be able to play rook a3, rook b3. The second rook can come to a8, and all of my pieces are just going to mobilize behind this pawn. So I played knight e2. There's really nothing else to suggest. I pushed a3, and now rook a1. This was the move I was mainly expecting, because this is the only way it seems like white can blockade the pawn. In fact, it turns out knight b5 was the only way, in fact, to keep the game going and keep holding the defense. The idea after a2 was to put the other knight on c3. And this is kind of a nice setup for white, with these two knights defending each other and blocking the bishop. But ultimately, it probably won't hold in the long run. It's just not so easy for black to break through immediately. But I think the idea here would be to slowly prepare the e6 break, maybe bringing this rook somewhere to like a5 or a6, at one point playing e6, and I think eventually this break will create enough pressure that white's position will one day collapse. It's just very, very hard to keep everything held together properly. You know, as soon as one knight moves, the other knight becomes extremely weak. And of course, this a-pawn is going to be on the board for a very long time. The bishop on g7 is super strong, and white's bishop on e3 kind of this whole time has been nothing but kind of a spectator, just not really doing a whole lot against black's super solid pawn chain. So okay, objectively this was still the best defense white could have tried, but would have been a difficult position regardless. My opponent played rook a1. Yeah, this was the move I was mainly expecting. I pushed a2 and rook hc1. Just, yeah, from afar, this felt like the most compact setup that white could try to achieve. But unfortunately, it just doesn't hold. So after rook a3, black's idea is to bring the second rook to a8. This rook will come to b3, and then I'll even have rook to b2 check, or the second rook can come to a3. And it's just It's just now the pieces are infiltrating into white's position. As soon as the king moves to d1 or e1, the knight can come in to d3, and yeah, basically white's setup is just not going to fall here, not going to hold here. Yeah, there's no point where white can even think about taking the a2 pawn, because black just always has too much pressure on the a file, and of course the rook on a1 is also hanging. So yeah, basically white is just completely stuck here, no way to untangle. He tried knight f4, I played rook b3, knight d3, and I just brought the second rook to a8. Of course, I'm certainly not worried about trading off this knight because I'll get to take with the pawn, and white is just going to be losing a ton of material here. And with black having 3 pawns for the piece, again, any kind of material win is going to be pretty huge. So if I win an exchange, then I'll just be up a ton of material. My opponent decided to try to just counter-sacrifice on c5. There's really nothing to suggest for white at this point. The position is just lost, so I was actually expecting something like either bishop takes c5 or knight takes c5, but both of these moves fall short. After bishop takes and knight c5, I have rook b2 check, and now material has basically equalized, except black has some extra pawns, but the rook is coming to a3, and the knight on c3 is just going to be under huge pressure. F2 pawn is hanging, and if king e1, there's also knight c2 check, and so everything is kind of collapsing. In the game, white played knight c5 and took with the bishop, but once again, after rook b2 check, black is just winning material on the spot. If king e3 or king e1, we have knight c2 check, and after king d1, knight d3 was the end of the game, hitting the rook and also hitting the bishop on c5. Actually, bishop takes c3. I paused here for a little bit because this was also a very clean way to win the game. Takes rook b1 check. White is forced to go rook c1, and then after taking and knight d3, we pick up the bishop on c5. I thought that was rather elegant as well, because I'm like finally giving up this dark square bishop and winning with the a pawn. But then I realized, okay, knight d3 is just like a one-move tactic and forces immediate resignation. So there's really no point but not to play this move. And so yeah, that was the end of the game. As you can see, I felt like this was a really clean win. I got to utilize this novelty, knight takes e4. Previously, queen b6 had been played, and I think this position after g5 has been reached before. But this was the first time knight takes e4 was played in tournament practice, as far as I know. And yeah, it's always nice when you get to play a novelty over the board and then you actually win the game. Because sometimes you play a novelty and you might get a good position, but then you mess it up and you don't actually win the game. And so it's like all that good prep just went to waste. But here I'm glad I got to take the full point out of it. And the game itself I felt like was of really nice quality. I had the luxury of knowing that all of these endgames in this type of position were quite good for black, and so because I knew that, I had no problem going for this endgame and just relying on the plan of pushing the a pawn forward. And yeah, I felt like I won a pretty nice game. Alright, so this win put me on, I believe it was 4.5 points out of 7, if I'm not mistaken. And I would continue with the final two. I'll continue with the final 2 rounds of the tournament in the next videos. So until then, take care.